Okay, we're recording. So I want to welcome everybody who's joined us for the last in our fall 2020 seminar series. And we will be picking up again in the spring. So I have no further seminars to announce beyond today's seminar. And I'm going to turn it over to Alicia Sabatino, who's our graduate student host for today, to introduce our distinguished speaker. So Alicia, take it away.
Thank you, Andy. If you have any questions for Dr. Beeler, please let us know in the chat and we will try to form a queue at the end of the talk. There will also be a longer discussion next Wednesday, December 9th at 12. And if you'd like to be part of the longer discussion, please email me and I can add you to the invite. I'll put my email in the chat in just a minute. I think we'll have some great discussion, so I'd love if you could join us. Dr. Beeler is an associate professor for the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems and an affiliate faculty member for the Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She does so much for UMBC students, UMBC as a university, and our own GS department. She has received several awards, grants, and fellowships for her multidisciplinary research, which covers urban environmental history, political ecologies of public health, urban and feminist political ecology, environmental and social justice, urban housing issues, and human-animal interactions. With her research, she provides us with a deep understanding of how our urban ecologies come into being and how race, gender, sexuality, and class are connected to our understanding and experiences of urban ecologies. For example, her last book, Pests in the City, Flies, Bedbugs, Cockroaches, and Rats, published in 2013 by the Washington Press, illuminated how pest ecologies are political, showing that the struggle to create healthy urban neighborhoods in the face of domestic pests is necessarily connected to racist, gender, and classist-based injustices, and how human health is implicated by pest ecology and pest control. She is currently writing up findings from two major projects. One is a 6-year collaborative study of environmental justice and mosquito ecology in West Baltimore. The other project is a historical geography of human justice, urban environmentalism, and multi-species belonging in New York's Central Park. This brings us to the seminar today, titled Urban Green Space and Belonging, Struggles for the Justice and Nature in Central Park. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Beeler.
Thanks so much, Alicia. That was a really lovely introduction. I really appreciate it, especially during these difficult times. And I want to share a bit of gratitude myself to the archival staff who have been so instrumental in my research, including folks who do a lot of practical public history projects in New York City. I want to thank the Drescher Center for the Humanities for giving me a semester where I could focus on this work, and especially the staff there, Courtney Hobson, Jessica Berman, and Rachel Brubaker. And I've given little talks about this material, and colleagues from other departments attended those at the Drescher Center. Dr. Chris Hahn has been an amazing writing buddy, and my fellow Drescher Fellows while I was there, Michelle Scott, Teresa Runstetler, and Catherine Benkel and Medina were the perfect people to be around while I was working on this. The Human Geography Roundtable group gave me some great feedback on a different chapter. As many of you know, this is part of that book that I'm working toward that Alicia mentioned. Maria Shcheglovitova and John Henry Pittis, among the grad students, have been amazing interlocutors during this time. We often texted while we were in our respective research arenas and added a lot of insight. And I really appreciate that Ohad Paris met with me and talked about some of the birds in this chapter that I'm going to be presenting. And then a couple of GES undergraduates, B. Brown and Ari Kasich, were really instrumental as research assistants during this process. So thanks to you all. My talk outline today is going to start by defining the problem of public space, urban nature, and belonging. I'm going to give you then a little context about Central Park in the early 20th century in the context of New York and the larger kind of northeastern urbanization at that time. And then I have two stories that I want to share that I think illustrate my the problem and then some of my concerns. One is about the struggle for space on bridle paths, and the other was dubbed by the New York Times at the time, the Battle of the Ramble. Then I want to draw some conclusions about urban animals and human justice today. I want to, it's kind of my practice to let you know about difficult issues that are going to arise so that if they affect anyone in the audience particularly, you can be prepared for that. So I'm going to be talking about racist and heterosexist exclusion from spaces in New York, also policing and violent policing, as well as sexual violence in the park. And I want to just mention the figure who's going to be kind of looming over this whole talk. This picture is of Christian Cooper. And I think most people are aware that Christian Cooper is a really established long-running birder in Central Park. He was in even a film about birders in Central Park prior to the incident this past April, where a white woman was walking a dog, her dog in the Ramble, which I'm going to be talking about. Chris Cooper tried to get her to follow the rules of dog walking there to protect the space and the birds. And she called the police on him. So I think most of you are aware of that incident and how Chris Cooper gained a great deal of fame as a Black man who is a birder in Central Park, and how this struggle for space and its affiliation with our association with animals remains really important. So I want to establish the problem that I'm kind of dealing with and some of the literature around this. So I want to start by talking about public space and why public space is important. And one entree into this comes from two geographers, Lynn Staley and Don Mitchell. And in their book, The People's Property, they write about how publicly accessible property shapes the people, determining who does and who does not appear to be persons with a legitimate claim on the polity. So basically, who belongs, whose citizenship or whose personhood counts. The relationship between people and property is never static. People, by taking and using public space, actively remake the public. And public space may, in some ways, be foundational in establishing who the people are. So our claims to humanity, our claims to our status as beings who matter, has a lot to do with our ability to exist and do what we do in public space. Use of public space is a form of accessing power. So this is speaking mostly to humans, but I think it's really important that we also talk about non-human animals and the complications of including them in that polity. And to this, I want to talk about the importance of urban green space. So taking public spaces and then looking a little bit more specifically at green spaces and how they're important at sustaining both humans and non-humans. When we're looking at non-humans, this sustaining power of urban green space is important for working animals, companion animals like dogs, especially, as well as wildlife in cities. And I'll be talking especially about, well, some working animals, horses that are perhaps also companion animals. The line is a bit blurred there, along with wildlife. So some geographers and eco-critics, Matthew Gandy is a geographer and Nicole Seymour is an eco-critic, have written about the idea of queer ecologies. And I want to explain where this comes from a little bit. So some of you might be familiar with the idea that the idea of wilderness, and that the most worthy spaces of environmentalist protection are those that have never been touched by humans. The notion of queer ecology challenges this. Matthew Gandy uses the space of Abney Park Cemetery in London to write about this. And this is that picture that you see here is an image of Abney Park Cemetery. Their vegetation grows wild ever since the cemetery's abandonment in the past few decades, and birders and wildlife advocates have come to know the space as a haven for many species that are otherwise rare in the city. And at the same time, men seeking companionship and sex with men, particularly older men, immigrants, and others who feel excluded from London's club scene, also find secluded meeting spaces. And Gandhi explains that wildlife enthusiasts and gay men have since the 1990s formed a sense of alliance and shared purpose around the preservation of this cemetery in this kind of unmanaged state. And it's especially important as London has become more of a surveillance city, which has record numbers of surveillance cameras. There's been a clearing of undergrowth and brush from a lot of spaces to allow unobstructed views by those cameras. And so what Gandhi shows is that, for one thing, to sustain both people and creatures, nature need not be pure or untouched like that myth of wilderness. But he also writes about heterotopic alliances, which draws from the ideas of Michel Foucault. But a heterotopic alliance, heterotopia, refers to spaces of really otherness, of different kinds of beings brushing up against one another. And the alliance part speaks to the ability of those different kinds of beings and different kinds of humans to have a shared sense of purpose around preserving access to that space. I'm kind of distilling down a whole article of his. Nicole Seymour is another person who's written about queer ecologies, and I'll refer to her a bit more as I get to my conclusion today. Okay, so that's another kind of body of literature that I think is important. I've got the public space, we've got kind of the queer ecologies literature. And then I want to talk a little bit about politics, humanity, and animality. And in recent years, with the growth of what's been called the animal turn in the social sciences and humanities, there has been a problematic tendency to compare the struggles for animal rights with the struggles of particularly civil rights for people of color. And so Claire Jean Kim and Bénédicte Boisseron have been particularly important scholars addressing this issue as kind of historians and philosophers and literary critics. And Kim particularly focuses on the way that the American left has become segmented, meaning that advocates for animals, advocates for nature, advocates for gay rights, advocates for civil rights. Each cause has its own cluster of advocacy groups and academic fields. Each engages the enemy, and we might talk about many different enemies, from its own bunker. Boisseron points to the need to understand the entanglement of all forms of oppression without kind of what she says, obstructing the idiosyncrasies of each, or without reducing them to all the same oppression. And so as I talk about forces that threaten the health and the habitat of animals, and that also threatened the belonging of people, I want to recognize that those are really different struggles, but they're struggles where we could create spaces, and that's where I'm going to get in my conclusion, spaces that these heterotopic alliances, really, spaces of multi-species belonging is what I want to argue for. Okay, and one more thing I need to say before I get into my stories is to introduce you a little bit to the context of Central Park in the early 20th century. So Central Park was built on land seized from many different people, including a small African-American community and many immigrant communities in the 1850s, built in the 1860s. So by the early 20th century, it's a number of decades old. And for people who care about the park, there is a constant narrative of decline by this point because of a limited maintenance budget. The growth of the population of Manhattan, and indeed the entire city, has increased. There's increased use from tourists and commuters as well. The physical decline of the park due to deferred maintenance is conflated all the time with moral and aesthetic decline. And there are camps of kind of park traditionalists who want to preserve the original spirit of the park against those who argue for pluralistic uses of the park. So basically the idea that people should be able to do more and more different things there and express themselves, be themselves in the many different spaces of this really enormous 800-acre park. So New York City, as I mentioned, and the urban agglomeration that it's in the middle of are expanding rapidly. There are fewer and fewer green spaces as suburbs grow out from the metropolitan areas all along the northeastern corridor. And so it's really important that animals, wildlife have spaces, and that's especially going to be important when we talk about birds. But we also need spaces for humans amid this urbanization. Within the city, we have also the change of where different people are living. So New York City's fairly small Black community has grown substantially in the 60 years of the park's existence. Well, it went down first and then it came back up quite sharply. So many of the Black residents of New York City have moved toward Harlem. They've been joined by Blacks from the South and from the Caribbean. And we have a number of queer communities in New York as well. Harlem is actually one of those communities. It's both Black and queer. And we're seeing heightened exclusion, policing, and violence against Black and queer New Yorkers. In 1934, Robert Moses becomes Commissioner of Parks, and he's going to play a big role in the second story. And the image here is just the seal pond in the Central Park Zoo, which is one of Robert Moses's first creations within the park, or reconstructions within the park. And he redoes the zoo with this very modernist, clean aesthetic, which becomes a problem for traditionalists, but for a while, the traditionalists actually like him. So I think that's what I need to introduce to you in terms of the context of Central Park in New York City around the early 20th century. So I can get kind of started into talking about the park. And here's an image of the park. I've turned it on its side, so it's actually like north-south oriented, but because we have more horizontal landscape-oriented devices, I've got this in the horizontal, and I'm going to be talking first about the bridle path. So it's a little hard to see here, but it's this long yellow, thicker line running around the outside of the park. And there's also a bridle path running around the reservoir. And then that's what I'm going to talk about first. And then second, I'm going to talk about the ramble, which is right about here. And it looks like I have about 15 minutes to talk about each. So we'll see how I do with that. This is a whole chapter in my book, and I've given like a bunch of conference presentations on each of these. And it's going to be a lot for me to do in 15 minutes, but I'm going to try. Okay. So I actually want to start a little bit earlier than the 20th century by giving you a sense of, let me see, sorry, I'm going to get a little bit lost here. Actually, I'm going to start with the early 20th century. So in the decades leading up to and including the Great Depression, as I've already mentioned, there's a constant discussion to the point of tedium that Central Park is falling into decline. And I'll give you a few numbers. By 1920, the park is 60 years old. The population of Manhattan, not counting the other boroughs that were incorporated in 1898, and the suburbs beyond that, goes from about 800,000 to 2.2 million. By the mid-19-teens, the city has reduced the annual budget for the park by up to $120,000 in money for those days, allowing little funding to address deferred maintenance or the increased pressure of users. In its report for 1926, the Manhattan section of the Department of Parks lamented the park, due to many years of insufficient appropriation and surrounding conditions, has deteriorated to such an extent that great remedial work was necessitated. So as of 1926, this consultant group that had been hired by the Parks Department recommended a lot more funding. For about 2 years in the late 1920s, they did get an infusion of funding. But then the Great Depression hit, as you know, in 1929. So there was very limited time when that higher budget could make up for all the lost years of maintenance of the condition of the park. Now is when I'm going to go back to the beginning of the park and talk a little bit about why there's a bridle path. I think it's really interesting and important to note. So when the Board of Commissioners of the Central Park solicited proposals for how to use the space back in 1858, the bridle path was one of the design competition's required elements. So in other words, there was going to be a bridle path no matter what. The cost of horse ownership in the city at that time meant only a really elite set of wealthy and almost exclusively white leisure riders would have access to this part of an ostensibly public space. And that's really why the park is created, to be the lungs of the city, to allow people to get outside and have fresh air and space to play. The many people who used horses for work at that time were confined to sunken roads rather than bridle paths. And so this very sizable feature of the park, over 5 miles of sinuous trails running around the outside and the reservoir, were built to be exclusive. And for decades, moneyed riders need not defend that privileged claim to be in that green corridor, where they alone could exercise, enjoy nature, and see and be seen by other fashionable elites. Going back to the early 20th century, this is a time when, with reduced budgets for greater awareness of the diversity of New York and the growing constituencies of all classes, it becomes harder and harder to justify the sustained investment in this bridle path for just this narrow group of people. There was a wider segment of the populace riding horses now. And there was a survey done in 1936 in part to benefit this constituency, showing that only 15% of equestrians in city parks owned their own horses. So in other words, people were renting horses from stables now. But the hourly rate at those stables still was beyond the reach of most New Yorkers. Bicyclists and runners were demanding access to bridle paths. And so the mayor started to restrict by hours who could ride when for all these people who wanted to use this great resource. Beginning in mid-October 1923, another group of new park users began to use the bridle paths. 6 members of the Harlem Young Women's Christian Association took advantage of a stretch of beautiful fall weather to enjoy this part of Central Park, which many of them had little experience with. That fall, and in several subsequent seasons, they took riding lessons sponsored by the YW and the Hoter Riding Academy on the West Side. An unnamed equestrian who advertised the class in the Amsterdam News, which is the Black newspaper for Harlem, spoke to the sense of freedom and contact with nature that came with experiencing the park on horseback. And you can see her quote there. Imagine it, imagine cantering along Central Park West, past the lakes, the reservoir, and so on. That repeated imagine it gives you a sense of what this really meant for this group of Black women. So in the short time I have for this story, I hope to show you how Black women claimed these spaces and experienced a sense of connection with nature, and how white riders' fears about Black women's presence and sexuality, along with the general economic conditions, perpetuated exclusion of Blacks. There were also Black men who rode in the park amid the growth of the middle and upper classes in Harlem society. But this pastime of riding came with a number of valences that were particularly important for Black women. So the freedom that horses and horseback riding provided for these women was about more than just the physical space and aesthetics. It was also a sense of safety and a new vantage point on the world. In the 1920s, many women New Yorkers of all colors approach Central Park with trepidation, especially if alone, because of rumors and reality of sexual violence and harassment there. Many men indeed targeted unaccompanied women in public space and with unwanted stares and comments, and Black women endured more of this harassment than their white counterparts. As one woman explained, life in New York was just like being in a den of beasts. Very interesting wording there. As historian Judith Wiesenfeld has written, police officers and civilian men alike assumed that Black women in public might be sex workers or otherwise sexually available. And as historian Saidiya Hartman has shown, many Black women face threats of arrest from police, threats of molestation from civilian men, and in the worst cases, these went beyond threats. Wiesenfeld writes that the Harlem YW helped Black women claim and make a public space for themselves in a city full of threats that tended to confine Black women to their homes. And as Saidiya Hartman has noticed, sometimes even their homes weren't safe. Likewise, from atop a horse, I argue, Black women seem to escape harassment, literally rising above the fray on the back of a tall, majestic, powerful creature. So with this experience in mind, the phrase imagine it gains a new valence. The Harlem YW asked Black women to imagine gaining, with the help of a horse, a feeling of control over their bodies and of safety and autonomy in public space. So I want to talk a little bit, actually, I think I'll stay there for a minute. I'm not going to have time to talk about this, but there was a horse farmer who moved up to New York, a Black horse farmer named Frank Tucker, who moved up to New York from Virginia. And he opened a stable, particularly in Harlem, to serve Black elites there. I'll just say a few things about them. He had 4 horses for hire. And there's a lot of really interesting literature showing how the women especially loved these horses. They connected with particular horses and had preferences for certain horses they would go riding with. Let's see. I also want to mention that for, as it did for whites, equestrianism in Central Park was an opportunity for Black women from Harlem to engage in fashionable display and social status. It was a chance, again, to see and be seen, and perhaps even get into the newspaper. I think I'll have some more newspaper clips about this a little bit later. So the gossip columnist Maurice Dancer often took pictures of women on their horses. He himself also rode. Bessie Augusta was the bookkeeper for the Turf Hunt Club established in Harlem and a constant fixture on the bridle paths. Harlem sporting goods stores published lists of the must-have riding gear for each season. So Black women claimed space on the bridle paths for many of the same pleasures that white women did: for contact with the natural landscape and communing with an animal, for exercise, and for social status and fashionable display. But for Black women, of course, there was this additional escape from harassment with the help of a horse, at least at the beginning. And with that, I want to shift to focusing on how Blacks claimed and made this space onto their limitations. Some of them coming from the expense of riding and Blacks' low wages, and some coming from whites' efforts to keep Blacks out of what had been an exclusive space for enjoying nature. Even the Harlem YW charged $15 for 10 riding lessons in the park. And when the average Harlem worker earned $25 a week and high rents took away much of this, it was a really rarefied pursuit, even at those reduced costs. But even Harlem's middle and upper crust faced discrimination as they tried to gain access to the bridle paths and horses. The Amsterdam News protested. I'm going to skip ahead because I think I put things a little out of order. Although it is the constitutional right of taxpayers of color to traverse the cindered promenades of Central Park, there appears to exist an unwritten agreement between the various riding academies to have their steeds conveniently engaged when Harlemites apply for mounts. So Frank Tucker, who'd come north to Harlem specifically to open a stable in Harlem, he was really a lifeline for these folks who were horse enthusiasts, because they were not able to rent horses from most of the West Side stables. Working class Black boys and Black men were often employed as stable workers, such as groomsmen caring for their horses. And there were many Black jockeys at this time, but Blacks riding horses for leisure in nature was almost unheard of. And it was even stranger to see Black women riding horses. The unwelcome reception that Blacks received on bridle paths was particularly ironic because of activism going on at the same time to show that the bridle paths welcomed everyone. So recall from the beginning of this story that the condition of the park was declining, and equestrians were having a hard time seeking funds to maintain the bridle paths because politicians perceived it as an elite activity. So in response to this, a group of white riders formed, calling themselves the Early Risers Club, who claimed to stand for democratizing the bridle paths. That was their actual language. Chaired by the prominent attorney Bernard Sandler, the Early Risers endeavored to increase ridership, make the city horse conscious, and overcome the bad optics of solitary riders and the perception that they were all ritzy riders and millionaires. And they did this by gathering huge numbers of people on the trails. I want to say a little bit about how bad the riding paths had gotten at this time. So, and the constant protests that went on. I don't have time to give you all the juicy quotes from this time period, but there were a lot of them. Remember that infusion of money that came in 1926 because of the consultants report. The riding paths were one of the main targets of that. So there was an infusion of money to make these better. But the problem is that you actually need constant maintenance. And they kind of employed some cheap solutions. One of them was these rocks that decayed by the constant contact of the horse's hooves, turning the paths into mud when it was wet and turning it into this dry dust that soaked the entire body of the horse and the rider, or covered the entire body. And that horses had to breathe, which then became a problem for the horse's health. When the paths had to be closed in order to correct these conditions, the stable owners complained that their horses were experiencing ill health from the lack of exercise. So this Early Riser Club rose up, and along with the ASPCA, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and the Women's League for Animals, and the Parks Association, so many primarily white organizations calling for the increased funding in the bridle paths. But we heard nothing from the early risers as they engaged in demonstrations, and even society women breaking through barriers on their horses in order to get arrested and draw attention to this situation. We heard nothing from them about the condition where Black riders were being confronted on the paths and being prevented from renting horses from the West Side stables. I don't mean to suggest that the early risers were engaging in direct discrimination, but their silence on this issue is really telling. And the worst episode happened a little bit later. So let's see, here's some of the New York Times headlines about the problems with the riders. Here's one of their elite, an announcement of one of their elite riding protests where they rode to get hot toddies at the end. So I don't know if that replaced the bad optics of elite riders. So here's Ethel Waters, who was a really well-known jazz and blues singer and actress who took up riding in Central Park as a way of letting off steam after her performances at the Cotton Club. Waters' biographer, Donald Bogle, relates that Waters and the chorus women that she performed with rode to let off steam, to exercise in nature between strenuous and taxing performances, and to just have fun. White audiences in Manhattan would have known Waters from her performances at the Cotton Club. She was extremely famous across color lines. But she and her fellow performers were also highly sexualized. She was associated both with kind of this like exotic sexuality, which I think is illustrated in the photo on the left, and also with her performance in drag. And she was known as a bisexual woman as well. When Waters and her fellow performers rode horses in Central Park, white riders and passersby gawked at them. But her fame doesn't explain what happened next. An anonymous group calling themselves the Equestrian Club visited the police station at Central Park's main building to report Waters and her friends to the police in Central Park for being disorderly and to have the group removed. Fortunately, the police declined to pursue the matter as the Equestrian Club had produced no evidence of improper conduct. But then, as today, white people reporting Blacks to police could have deadly consequences. And there had actually been a Black drag performer murdered in the park just a few years before. The Equestrian Club then visited the West Side stables to demand that they not hire horses to Waters and her friends, and finally announced a boycott of her performances if she did not stop riding in the park. So to conclude this episode, and here's some of the Black newspapers' coverage of this episode. The Black community, particularly women, found a special refuge in Central Park's bridle paths with horses that they knew and loved, thanks to the entrepreneur Frank Tucker, who stabled those horses and gave riding lessons. I argue, though, that these assumptions about Black women's presence in space and their kind of being stereotyped as sexually available ultimately limited their ability to enjoy those spaces freely. I want to move on quickly, really quickly to my second story. And I'm going to have to go really quickly through this one. So this one's going to focus on the Ramble. And the Ramble, from the very early days of Central Park, was known as a place that was welcoming both to wildlife and to lovers. And let's see, so I'm actually going to use this image really quickly. So here's in the upper left, here's a really typical image of a venue in the Ramble, a vista in the Ramble, really densely planted. This was in Frederick Law Olmsted's vision of the park. This was considered to be the picturesque aesthetic, where it was made to look like a wild and overgrown area. And this is from the lower left here. This image is from an 1860s guide to the park. And this shows another vista in the Ramble. These little kind of alcoves or edicules are built, and they were often known for lovers gathering spots. Where a couple might enjoy a private tryst within public space. And the guidebook author who wrote about this in the 1860s wrote quite affectionately about people having the opportunity to find this secluded spot out in nature in public. But as time went on, there were certain people who were excluded from this kind of encounter in the park. Here, though, I want to go back to someone who was successful in making a place for himself and his fellows in the park, Ludlow Griscom. So Ludlow Griscom is labeled with number 20 here. He's the young man in the tuxedo facing the camera. And he was one of the earliest birders in Central Park. As of 1900, he was about 10 years old. Here in this picture in 1914, he would have been, let's see, sorry, he was 10 in 1900. So by this point, he would have been 24. He started birding in Central Park when it was still really an unusual thing. And I know I'm really low on time here. I'm gonna try to figure out how to cut on the fly. So it was already well recognized by organizations like the Audubon Society, the American Ornithological Union, and the Linnaean Society by the late 19th century that the Ramble sheltered extraordinary bird diversity because of the way it was so densely planted and secluded, and offered these paths that allowed the space to remain secluded. At the same time, Ludlow Griscom, as a young man, took part in a growing but still small group of birders who gazed into the Ramble's dense forest through opera glasses, scouring the brush for warblers and night herons. Urban birding was already quite popular in Boston, but the white elite and middle class men and boys who tried to bring the same practices into New York in 1900 felt conspicuous in spite of their privileged position in society and public space. Griscom later recalled, in 1900, we were quite eccentric and barely respectable. I can remember the astonishment of people seeing us gaze steadily through the glass into the treetops and the shamefaced way in which most of us used to do it. He remembered furthermore that you could hunt and shoot birds, but you couldn't ogle birds with a glass. Many is the time a derisive and unfriendly crowd has run me out of Central Park. Griscom recognized that styles of occupying space and enjoying nature were important. Hunting birds came off as robust, masculine, and decisive, but birding with the eyes seemed somehow effete, refined, and too introspective. But over time, birders claimed their space in the Ramble. And by the 1920s, Griscom was a rising star at the American Museum of Natural History. He called the Ramble by that time a rendezvous for bird lovers, and the Central Park birders collectively a clan, now considered entirely sane and normal by the public. Members of this cultish group of physicians, businessmen, authors, schoolboys, and teachers, largely white men and boys, as shown here, it claimed this space quite effectively and without argument by the 1920s. And even police supported them in their efforts to use this space, passing notes to late arrivals to tell them where a rare bird was found. So as we've already seen in the case of Black equestrians, authorities and privileged visitors had long used visible markers of identity and style to delineate who was belonging and who belonged and who did not in Central Park. And here I come back to the idea that lovers could find a place in Central Park, but not if your gender and sexuality was of the wrong type, according to authorities of the time. By the 1920s, authorities in New York applied laws, public decency and disorderly conduct laws, increasingly to queer people using public space, with the goal of entirely erasing them from these spaces and from visibility. This was accompanied by increasing arrests and policing within Central Park. The historian George Chauncey explains that New York City's police and courts construed the disorderly conduct statute to mandate a much broader ban on gay cultural practices. The Ramble had a reputation as a site of gay cruising as well as covert sex, but authorities regularly used the statute to criminalize simply the assembly of gay men in a public space or their adoption of particular cultural styles, from camp behavior to dancing with people of the same gender or wearing clothes assigned to the other gender. That's all from George Chauncey, whose book, Gay New York, was really great help for me. Men need not have been caught in any stage of the sex act together to face arrest. Simply performing with queer affect or sitting on a rock too close to a person assigned the same gender could draw the attention of police, who enjoyed wide latitude to detain and courts wide latitude to sentence. So gay assembly was being criminalized, and yet during a period of relatively low policing, this photo on the right was taken, and this is included in Chauncey's work. The Ramble was not merely a danger to queer people, it was also a space of community and belonging. In the same features of the Ramble that attracted birds and thereby bird watchers also attracted other men sending messages to each other in the landscape. The Ramble offered vast stretches of unsupervised wooded land full of secluded spots, as George Chauncey explains. Furthermore, lone or paired wanderers in the Ramble could use nature appreciation as their cover, and surely many did enjoy nature there. So I'm going to skip over a little bit and talk about, I'm going to take it for granted that we understand that the Ramble was a really important spot for birds. It was a migratory stopover, one of the very few large migratory stopovers for many transient species, also important for some resident species. Other parts of the park that are more kind of pastoral or like a college campus landscape with wide lawns and more human habitation would have had some more, sorry, I'm skipping forward to show you. So here's some examples of kind of more rare and transient species, but robins, mockingbirds, cowbirds would have found the other parts of the park would have been able to colonize those areas of the park quite effectively. So I want to fast forward to the 1950s. The degradation of the physical park has continued. Meanwhile, the status of the birders is firmly established, and the birding community had a chance to use its privileged position to support queer fellow ramblers in 1955. In that year, so here I'm going to go back to Robert Moses. Robert Moses and Iphigene Ox Sulzberger, a philanthropist and the matriarch of the New York Times publishing dynasty, conceived an idea to provide a space in the park for another underserved group, elder New Yorkers, and to rid the Ramble of queer men. Sulzberger and Moses encouraged philanthropist Lula Lasker to help support the construction of a senior center in the Ramble. Lasker agreed to donate $250,000 to be named for a center to be named the Florina Lasker Recreation Center for Older People, named after Lasker's sister. And what this center would have done, I'll explain this really quickly, and I think I'm going to take a little bit into the 1250 zone, so we'll just have a few minutes for questions. I'm sorry about that. But the plans would have dramatically remade the environment for wildlife as well as for humans. Queer birders, and casual visitors alike who were accustomed to using it. In addition to it, introducing a building on the site and a parking area to serve it, some vegetated areas would be cleared for recreational facilities, such as croquet courses and a shuffleboard court. Outdoor tables would dot the area, and all of these facilities would necessitate considerable vegetative cover to be cleared. The outcry from birders was swift and vociferous when the Parks Department released plans for the Lasker Center in May of 1955, decrying the negative effects the development would have on birds. Indeed, considerable shelter and habitat would have been removed, resources that were important for species such as warblers and wood thrushes. Birds that have limited sheltering requirements, such as robins, mockingbirds, catbirds, and cardinals, may have found it easy to take over the reordered niches here. The Lasker Center would not have eliminated all birds from the area, but it would have made a more impoverished and unwelcoming environment for birds with few other options for stopover and nesting habitat. Birders recognized the threat of Moses's plan to this unique avian community, and also that their treasured recreation area would be destroyed. In a statement meant to reassure the birdwatching community, Moses explained, serious bird watchers will be admitted at early hours of the morning during the migration periods, and all orderly adults would be admitted at all times. Representatives of the Linnaean Society met with Moses to attempt to arrive at a compromise plan for the center and the ramble that would protect birders and birders' access. Moses's response to the birders made clear that the plans for the ramble were intended in part to exclude unwanted users. His language was coded, but a close reading shows that men seeking sex and companionship with men topped his list of undesirables. In a public statement intended to calm the birders' worries, Moses explained, the fencing, additional lighting, and regular use of this part of Central Park as a recreation center for older people will make the ramble, which has been the scene of muggings, acts of vandalism, and other nuisances, once again a safe and pleasant place available to the public for the purpose for which it was originally intended. Moses argued that this was absolutely essential if the reconstructed area is to be maintained as a quiet area for passive recreation, and if the conditions which originally made it attractive to birds are to be restored and preserved. Moses framed the restoration of the ramble with a senior center as necessary to maintain the physical and ecological integrity of the area, including the birds that the birding community was fighting for. He promised to resist any improper invasion or misuse of the area, which he claimed was being eroded at an alarming rate. Still, with all of his work with the birding community, the Lasker Center plans were eventually scrapped by December of 1955. I'm skipping over a whole bunch of information because I want to get to the end of the story. And the big, I guess the big takeaway from that story is that neither Moses nor the bird watchers envisioned a place for queer men in the ramble. And one of the compromises that they arrived at was increased policing of the area, which is covered in the New York Times in 1956 under the headline, Night Made Safe in Central Park, where police on foot and on horses invaded the ramble to root out people engaging in what they considered improper activity. So in the interest of wrapping up with, I'm sorry for leaving just a few minutes left, but I want to draw some lines from these days, from Ludlow Griscom's time to today, about whiteness, heteronormativity, and the enjoyment of urban nature. White environmentalists often constructed their identity and claims to space through their shared fate with birds, trees, and treasured spaces, also horses. This was an example of single issue environmentalism. Black and queer New Yorkers were excluded from the political project of protecting white environmentalists' access to urban nature. And there was an enforcement of a purity of style in urban nature. Human sex and sexuality, glamour, theater must not spill over among the birds, trees, and horses. So I want to conclude really quickly with some comments about how we can rethink belonging in urban nature. These two relatively brief moments in the history of Central Park tell us much about how animals could be privileged over humans in struggles for public space. White, straight protesters raised loud voices for themselves and for animals, and although it took months of resistance, their demands were eventually heard, in part because they enrolled animals as vulnerable adjuncts. Black equestrians like Bessie Augusta and Ethel Waters, and hundreds of gay men who faced dire threats in the Ramble did not enjoy such protection or political position. For these New Yorkers, occupying public space was a kind of quiet protest in itself that nonetheless required sustained bravery in the face of exclusion and aggression. They were not studious birders staring into the trees or horse riders in English costume. They brought their own styles to the park that were often flamboyant or just other in the white and heteronormative environment of the park. On the other hand, horses felt the stab of gravel in their feet and the sting of dust in their noses, throats, and lungs, the discomfort and illness of being unable to exercise. Birds like warblers and wood thrushes never suffered the effects of the Lasker Center, but they might have endured longer flights without the sheltering acres of the Ramble, or reduced ability to seek food and nesting had the Ramble been overbuilt. Urban public spaces served vital and diverse functions for humans and other creatures, including a sense of freedom and belonging in urban space. Limiting access and funding to maintain these spaces for plural publics carried dire costs for society and ecology. As part of Nicole Seymour's call for queer ecologies, she describes a need for broader environmental imaginations and radical empathy to counter rigid ideas of who and what belong in natural landscapes. The Bridle Path and the Ramble show that there's much room for dominant imaginations of parks to expand. And of course, now we have the example of Christian Cooper's experience, including not only birds and horses that were unusual in the big city, but also people who could redefine the idea of urban nature. Thank you for hanging on with me, and I'm sorry for the very long presentation, and I would love to hear questions.
Don, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great presentation. I really enjoyed it. Having been to these places, I found it really fascinating to put them all in context. I feel like a lot of the stories that you were telling aren't really focused on. And the park's history is much more multi-layered than I expected, especially the Bridle Path. There's a broader context here in that the park as a whole has had a reputation for urban crime going back a century. And in the 1980s, that really peaked. I mean, I think there were like a few hundred felonies, many dozen felonies in the park just in 1980 alone. I think there were more felonies in 1980 than the entire 18th century, 19th century. And I was wondering, is it really that I think fear gives people freedom to do bad things to groups that are on the outside. So I'm wondering, was it focusing on, people who are engaged in acts that were outside the norm? Or it was just urban crime people were fearful. And that was a way that they could show that they were cracking down without actually being effective. So the police could show they had people to arrest, even though crime rates weren't going down. They just picked a group that was no one, was going to stand up and defend, and then they cracked down on that group especially. It reminds me kind of like 9/11 in miniature, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I really appreciate your comments, Matt, especially since you're someone who's lived near the north end. You went to school near the north end of the park, so you know this area and you've spent a lot of time around there. So thanks so much for your question. So going back to the 1920s through the 50s, certainly the crime rates that you described for the later 20th century probably weren't quite the same, though maybe if you divided it over the population, it would be fairly similar. I would have to look at those statistics a bit more, and it's a good point that I should be incorporating some of those crime statistics into the study. And I also want to emphasize that a lot of the people that I mentioned were experiencing crime, were targets of crime, not just by policing, but by civilians. And so queer people and Blacks in the park were experiencing violence from civilians. So they were often the victims of those crimes. I don't think it's the case, though, that this was just like some easy group to crack down on. So, and for this, I would refer to George Chauncey's History, Gay New York. And I haven't had a chance to read this yet, but Jack Gieseking has just come out with a book called Queer New York, which I need to incorporate as well. But what Chauncey argues is that there's this committee, the Committee of 14, that in the early 20th century really starts to target queer folks all over the city. And so there's this, this retraction of space for queer folks everywhere. So it's not just the park, it's hotels, it's bars, it's other spaces in the city. And so I think that's actually the proper context to put the policing in, is the heightened policing of queer people. And I didn't have time to include all of that in today's talk, but I think that's really important. And a lot of the literature reports about both the, it was actually called gay bashing or queer bashing, people being beaten for appearing to be not cis heteronormative everywhere in New York City, but for my study, the Ramble especially.
Thanks, Dawn. That's a really shameful history, but it's important to know. I've got to hop off and go watch some kids, but thank you. I really loved your talk.
Thanks so much for your question, Matt. I will definitely include a little bit more context about crime. I'm revising this right now for sending back to my publisher.
Oh, wonderful. I look forward to reading it when it comes out.
Thanks, Matt.
Okay, thanks. Dawn, I know you said you had to go at 1, and we're now at 1:01, so I don't know whether you need to stop now.
I'm good.
Okay. So if people want to stick around for a few minutes and ask some more questions, you're welcome to do so. Just unmute yourself.
I had a question. Dawn, that was wonderful. Just
thank you. And I don't know if you were here at the beginning to hear that I gave you a shout out as my writing buddy.
Oh, thanks. It was great to hear more of the stories as we were writing through. And one of the things that I was thinking about was with the bridal paths again, and love hearing the predecessors of Black drag performers on horses. That was just a wonderful image that I'll keep with me for a long time. But I was also thinking about, you're talking a lot about these divisions in class, and for the argument of that white people were making was that the park was for, the bridal paths were for everyone, or everyone white, right? And everyone within certain categories. And the visual of Black riders in this space was important, but I was also wondering about the runners, walkers, or other people, if that was also like what was there any connection between Black riders, which were often upper class, and maybe lower class Blacks or other people in general, but that were using the space in more low income ways, if there was any connection between those folks, and if the presence of Black riders changed accessibility in general for the space, or were they really just also trying to keep that an exclusive writing space as well?
That's a great question. So most of the articles about Black writers are about, they're either about like fashion and getting together in high society, or they're about these white people who are trying to keep us off the paths. And there's maybe like one article that's about both of those things, and kind of playing with some of those ideas of like being showy the way the white people were, but being showy in our own way. But that's a really great question too. I did not see any of that. I mean, at the same time, there are definitely bicyclists and runners who are starting to use these paths in greater and greater numbers, but nothing in either the kind of Black archive of Harlem kind of coming down from the north end of the park, or the government archives suggested to me that there was like standing up for those, for any people coming from Harlem using those paths. But I also didn't look for that because I usually looked for equestrians when I was doing my searches. So you're actually giving me another thing to look up. Like, were there runners or other people exercising on those paths? I really like that question. So I'm gonna look into that.
Cool.
Does anybody else want to ask Dawn a question that will cause her to pursue a new line of research? Or not?
Hey, I had a question. Dawn, it's nice to see you. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Sometimes I have issues. Yeah, and it's so nice to see how this has evolved since I read a little bit at the Human Geography Roundtable. But I like that you distinguished between multi-species belonging and flourishing. I had read it, mostly as flourishing. And it made me wonder, does belonging always lead to flourishing? What is necessary for claiming a multi-species space where humans and non-humans can not only belong, but also flourish?
Yes, this will be another thing that I need to think about more as I rewrite this chapter. I have maybe 1,000 words that I can add. Let me take a little pause as I think about that. My mind is racing, and I don't know whether I'm going to come up with my best ideas. Frankly,
I've got one for that. I really think that the correlation between if it's good for gay sex, it's good for biodiversity, needs to go into your book. The cover, all that kind of stuff. There's a really strong correlation that I think is really there.
I think Matthew Gandy would wholeheartedly agree. I think in our, well, now that thought was going nowhere. Never mind. If anyone has additional suggestions beyond Dr. Hans, I would very much appreciate additional suggestions about what distinguishes flourishing, multi-species flourishing in these kind of spaces in urban nature. I think, so I'm gonna ramble a little bit, no pun intended. So Nicole Seymour has a couple of really great books about queer ecology and kind of going off the beaten path of typical environmentalism. And what she says is that, like, basically the white mainstream environmentalists need to completely reimagine what they mean by environment and what is good for the environment. And of course, that you're still going to keep like biodiversity as one of these things, but an expansion in the thinking of what belongs in urban nature is, I think, the most important thing here. And I was going somewhere with that, and I kind of lost my train of thought. Oh, I know. So I think some of this has to do with our really old images of nature. And if we start kind of digging up some of our old images of, like, John Muir walking through the woods, right? Or of a pristine wilderness, some of those pictures from the old Hudson River School of Painting, where you've got places that actually were home to plenty of Indigenous Americans, but you've got it cleared of people, you've got a beautiful sunrise in the background, and you've got a few antelope peacefully grazing in the foreground. And that's, I think, what Nicole Seymour is kind of talking about with this expanded imagination. It's kind of like clearing that stuff out of our minds when we think about urban nature, which is what the ramble was supposed to be. It wasn't necessarily supposed to be like the mountains against the sunrise, but it's this like densely planted, wild looking thing. And part of the aesthetic is that there's supposed to be no people there. You're supposed to be able to go around a corner on this path and not see any people at all. And part of the problem is that lack of people. There's a place for people in these landscapes, and there's not just a place for people kind of in this universal all people, but for lots of different people doing lots of different things. So that's my kind of rambly way of answering that. But thanks so much, Maria, for Dr. Szczegłowiczova, I should say, for raising that question, because I need to clarify what I mean by that.
Okay, any last questions for Dawn?
I'm finishing these revisions this month, so now's your chance. You say it now, it makes it into the manuscript.
Now, how often do you get an offer like that during a seminar, right? You ask me a question and I'll put it in my book.
I can't resist that. This is Jason.
Hi, Jason.
Hi. Hey, I actually have no advice. I just think it's such an amazing synthesis of so many different, it's like what I love about interdisciplinary scholarship, the way you're able to bring together history and human geography and these important discourses of power. And around the edges, I saw very definitely media studies as well, the ways in which discourses through the press are used and through public statements by organizations are used to try to stake different kinds of claims for what the park means and what everyone means. So I just really enjoyed it, and so generative, so much to think about. So maybe that can be a blurb on the back of the book.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. That means a lot coming from you. And I want you to know that I love MCS. and hanging around with you all has been a really important part of the formation of this book. So yeah, Fawn was there, Liz was there, you've been there, Rebecca. So shout out to you all. I'm very influenced by MCS.
Well, it's great. I can't wait to read the book.
Me too.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, I think we'll bring it to a close. Thanks, Dawn, for really fascinating journey through Central Park. You know, I grew up in the suburbs of New York and spent a fair amount of time in Central Park, so I don't remember all the geographic locations, but it's really interesting to look back at its history and think about all these interactions that I was probably unaware of as a teenager. This brings us to the close of our fall semester seminar series. We will pick up in the spring. I know we will be kicking off with a JSET poster session, which we were unable to do in December this year, and we will be announcing the schedule as we go forward. So thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks to friends who are joining us from afar. Great to see you, Maria. I saw Ed Ortiser on this list and a number of other folks that are joining us. So we look forward to seeing you again soon. And thanks very much, Dawn.
Thank you.